Hi all, I'm very pleased to say that today's game was enormously exciting and interesting. Fantastic dynamics of chess, pass pawns, king safety, attack and counter-attack. It had everything, this game. Vishy Anand playing white against Magnus kicked off with d4. I had my good friends Paul Georgia and Alex Avalontis for live commentary. There's a very extended, detailed 3-hour version of this video for the live commentary. So I'm just going to try and summarise some of the key ideas and findings. And let's see. So knight f6 was chosen by Magnus, and we saw c4, e6, and I was expecting maybe Queen's Indian is very, very popular at GM level. I think more popular than just playing knight c3. It's actually the more mainline move now is the Queen's Indian, avoiding the pin which knight c3 implies. So we see knight c3, so we're into the Nimzo-Indian defence, named after Aaron Nimzovich, one of the leading hypermodernists. It seems the hypermodernists actually have a lot to do with this match, because in earlier games we saw the Reti, after Richard Reti, another hypermodernist, but Nimzovich is pet line here, bishop b4, threatening to double white's pawns, giving up the bishop pair voluntarily. And there's Rubinstein's move is e3, and that's actually, I think, the most played throughout history is e3. It's a very solid move. Queen c2 is one of Kasparov's favourite moves. Knight f3 is another popular choice, but we saw f3, which is also a very, very interesting move. And the idea is usually to try and construct the centre and kick the bishop, not play another pawn move to get this centre strengthened with the doubling of pawns, so it can be seen as an advantage if the pawn here is supporting d4. Magnus chooses the main line move, which is d5, and we see a3, and there is a minor option for bishop e7 which is sometimes being played, but this is the main move, just to take on c3. B takes c3, and now c5, main line we're following. Here it gets a little bit interesting after c takes d5, that usually it's knight takes d5, and I was anticipating knight takes d5. In my live book it's over 800 games with that, and ed, which was played, is actually about a quarter, 211, nearly just a quarter. So e takes d was played. If we have a quick look, just to show you, knight takes d5, and usually it's d takes c5 now, and this sort of game could occur usually, where white's slightly better overall. It's supposed to be white's got a slight edge in this variation, but in fact we saw Magnus playing e takes d5, and it's got a really, really radical idea to keep black's pawn chain together. We're about to see after e3 that usually players don't like to release the tension here. The most common move is actually just to castle, keeping this kind of central tension. When will black play c takes d4? What will be the most appropriate time? So that tension is kept, and white doesn't really want to play d takes c5 here. Usually he's fragmenting his pawns even more, and so the most usual move is castling. For example, like bishop d3, b6. You see that the central tension here is kept. But what we see is a rather, it took myself and Paul, I think it took all of us back, basically to see this move, which is, in my life, but it's only been played 30 times, c4. It's releasing the tension. Okay, it's depriving the bishop of d3, but even more popular again is queen c7, just keeping the tension. I think the castles or queen c7. But c4, a bit of a surprise, only 30 games we're talking about in live, but compared to like 136 of castling. It just looks like, at one level, it looks as though a move which maybe club players that are not that experienced sometimes release the tension in the centre, and they get rolled later with this e4, e5 in principle. If that's prepared, it's like either to go to e5 or just to smash the pawn chain. But there is some very interesting ideas behind it now. It marks the b3 square. That's one thing it does. It also creates this kind of pawn majority on the queen side, which can be potentially rolling later. So there's various implications of that, and part of that is this rook could be used along the 6th rank. White's got that a2 square for his rook sometimes to go to f2. That's quite a common attacking idea in this sort of position, though, as well to consider. So the main move in this position is knight e2, and it looks as though we were discussing, knight g3 potentially with e4 might be rudely interrupted with h5. And that's where I think I predicted in advance what would happen now after knight c6. If we go for knight g3 straight away, let's put on the Kibitzer here. We're kind of out of most of the book. So if we went for knight g3 here, it might not be out of the question to play h5. In fact, that's Houdini likes h5 here. Pardon me, h5. Just trying to chase this knight away. So white will never easily get this plan of e4. I'm not entirely sure how white would proceed in this position, in fact. So Vishy's move, it looks a bit crazy, I think, to a lot of people, but in the circumstances, with the central tension released like this is a lot more justified. Factor in white's got the bishop pair as well. He plays actually g4, and I kind of anticipated this, because now any h5 can be responded to with g5, and we're still trying to get this knight g3. So we want our cake and eat it. We want to support e4 without this hassle of h5 h4. It looks a bit strange to be creating weaknesses in principle, though, and from an engine point of view, this position is actually engine seems to like black, but in terms of attacking play and possibilities, I think most humans would generally prefer white coming up, because it's sometimes unpleasant to have this fear that you're going to get mated at any time. And it was kind of clear, actually. Magnus Carlsen himself said he did fear in this game possibility of getting mated. This is a very, very sharp position indeed. The pawns are the soul of chess. Our choice of openings helps determine the pawn structure. We've got other imbalances going on. It's not just the pawn structure here. We've got other imbalances, the bishop pair, and this central tension release. We've got different space attributions here. Black's got more space on the queen side, pawn majority here versus the two pawns. There's a ton of imbalances to try and work around here. So it's kind of really, really murky position to try and assess correctly. And the tiniest nuances might change, who's actually better here. So we see black just castling into it. Magnus just castles into it. He just castles here. So he doesn't seem to mind these possibilities of, knight g3 and g5 later. It was king there, with white having the bishop pair. But if white plays knight g3 here, this might not be... it's probably going to transpose into what happened anyway. White played bishop g2, a viable just option. He wants to try and castle kingside. So bishop g2 gets on with, now technically he can castle if he wants. And in fact, after knight a5, white just immediately castles. He's got knight g3 anytime he wants it now. Now the knight comes to b3. And we see this rook a2 move. So white doesn't mind losing actually the dark squared bishop here. Is it good to take? Well, let's give an example. If this is taken, that's a kind of tension release as well. Instead of continually asking the question, is the bishop going to take, when's the most effective time to take, it's a kind of tension release in its own right. And white's still going to end up playing for e4 after some preparation like h3. So for example, or maybe even like this, just to go with g5, and then maybe even consider, okay, e4 here, and then we've got knight g3. And this looks comfortable for white to get this seemingly thematic break in the center here. But unless there's any like concrete mating method, black's position can be seen as tenable, and I think that's part of a lot of what Magnus Carlsen was saying. He was trying to just calculate well with black here and make sure he wasn't going into a dire state of king safety. So let's see, in the game we see after this rook a2 the tension is maintained here of take the bishop at the right time. Magnus plays b5, and I did actually predict this kind of plan, believe it or not, in advance, that a5 would be useful for rook a6. It's very rare to get this kind of operation on the 6th rank. It comes out of certain openings like the Budapest Gambit, that sometimes the whole 3rd rank is clear, but here we've got knight on f6. But here with this space gain, it's another idea, 2 ideas, to activate the rook, and also b4 to try and either undermine the pawn structure, but even a more quiet plan, just trying to generate a passed pawn on the queen side, is actually a really viable plan. You know, even just with b3. So let's see what happened. Knight g3 now is played. There's an enormous number of attacking possibilities to consider here. Let's just briefly look at g5. It would seem, for example, knight h5 might be a nuisance just to stop white using the f4 square, e4, a5, and now the whole 3rd rank is clear, and this kind of position is going to be a hard nut to crack. How do we get actually concretely at black's king? But black's also got to worry about the d5 pawn. But it seems if this is if there's no clear way through, then black seems solid enough here. So okay, in the game though, okay, after b5 we see knight instead of g5 we see knight g3. So g5 has been kept in reserve here. There's also, by having the pawn on g4, there's a possibility of knight f5 even, or h3 next, then e4, e5. A lot of dangerous possibilities. In fact, after a5, we see g5. So the knight on g3 prevents that knight h5 possibility in advance. So chasing the knight back, where does it want to go? It actually goes to e8. And it looks as though, it looked for a while as if a defensive idea in this position is trying to blockade potentially one day on f5 with an idea of like g6 finishes the knight just to control that f5 square. It's interesting to consider. If for example f4, and how does this actually work here? Maybe it's unnecessarily weakening dark squares to play g6. Engines actually suggest f5 here, so black has to be kind of careful. With g6 this might actually give white a very strong initiative with e4, so black has to be playing very precise defensive moves. I think that's one of the things Magnus emphasized, that he had to try and play only moves a lot of the time. But anyway, so knight e8, we see e4 instead of f4, and now the bishop might be threatening in some lines to come to f4, which could be quite dangerous. There's actually bishop f4 is actually a very nice move in its own right, just to make that knight a kind of spectator piece. Dare I say the term spectator piece? But it would be a bit of a spectator if the bishop's on f4. That could be useful for attacking on the dark squares later. So it's at this moment, before the bishop has a chance to make an appearance there, that it's actually snapped off. Now knight takes c1 is played by Magnus. Queen takes c1, and we see this this defensive rook move, which has been afforded by b5 and a5. So the rook's seeing through across that 6th rank here defensively. Very interesting position indeed. There's tons of analysis of possible attacking scenarios in the live commentary video. If you've got 3 hours sometime or more to go through that, it's quite fascinating. But let's see what was chosen. On move 18 it was now e5 was chosen. So this pawn could also be a target though to this fianchetto bishop at any time. That's another thing to bear in mind, that d5 is also like a target. It's reinforced a little bit with Magnus's next move, which not only reinforces it, but also there's a possibility of using either e6 or e8 if there's some trouble ahead on g7. And after f4 now, okay, pressure being put on d5, and also this idea that f5 and potentially f6 is dangerous, or ideas like knight h5. All of these are like storm clouds brewing, and Magnus is soon to describe these pawns as menacing. That's the adjective being used for these pawns. Once they're together there, e5, f5, g5, this set of 3 menacing pawns is about to appear. So what does Magnus do? He has to create counterplay in this position, otherwise he's just going to be rolled over on the king side. What's the nature of the counterplay is exceptionally exceptionally interesting and also surprising and shocking in a way, because it seemed exceptionally humble, to be honest, the way he played this position. If you follow Nimzo my system, there's a school of thought which is about pawn chain undermining, and it would seem one obvious, fairly obvious plan for black, especially the knight on c7, is this idea of undermining the pawn chain at its exploitable base, and that could be followed by knight b5 if the bishop is there for a rook exchange, and we could carry on trying to undermine this pawn chain and maybe even play things like queen b6. It looks like a kind of French defense classic strategy. But what we get is a very surprising twist indeed coming up. We get b4 here. Sure, it looks as though it might be that plan. White takes on b4 here. There's various other possibilities, of course. Perhaps interesting is just to play f5 and get along with the attack and try and allow b takes c3 to happen. Sorry, f5 here. Sorry, f4, b4. If f5 had been played here, just trying to ignore black's undermining, you know, we're getting really an exceptionally dangerous looking attack on the dark squares around the king here, especially that g7 target. And it's fascinating to consider the scenarios here. So this is if Vishy didn't take on b4. For example, here, if b takes c3, f6, g6, this is really testing this g7. It just looks quite dangerous, but if there's nothing concrete, if the knight's ready to defend g7, and the king might move if needed at some point, is it as dangerous as it actually looks? So anyway, in the game, we actually saw a takes b4, and a pair of rooks come off. Rook takes a6, and here is kind of a surprising move. I think we were really expecting bishop takes a6, and because we wanted the knight to be like playing a potentially defensive role for e6 to be able to protect g7. But what we saw in the game was a little bit of a surprise. Knight takes a6, so it looks as though the knight's a little bit further from the king here. But it does, this bishop all the time, it hasn't moved, but it's doing a useful job on this diagonal. But now, here is the time at move 22, where we get this set of three absolutely menacing looking pawns. So f5, it just looks as though Magnus is facing, his king is facing the firing squad. If you look at this rook's extending in scope, the queen's got some aggressive squares to jump around, the pawns are threatening f6, the knight's a little bit further from the defense. So it looks as though, is Magnus really, is he really playing like this? This is unbelievable. And what's really the humbling strategic choice, I think a lot of club players would have been thinking about undermining the pawn chain, but clearly because of knight takes a6, there's no possibility of knight b5 immediately to press on these pawns. This pawn chain undermining strategy is totally being bypassed in favour of something which is seemingly not as significant and maybe give white a lot of attacking prospects. Black instead bypasses this opportunity to bite on the chain and plays what Engine's really like here, which is just b3. Of course, Magnus in a couple of earlier games had won games with passed pawns, but here is his king's safety is at stake here to generate this passed pawn here. It's an outside passed pawn, but what is it actually doing? There is a very, very famous Nimzo quotation, a profound one. The threat is stronger than the execution. So even though it might not actually be threatening at the moment to queen, its potential to threaten to queen could actually tie down valuable resources of white. And if white starts to blockade these away from the attack, as soon as he pays attention to this potential queening pawn, he can say goodbye to his attack. So this is the point where I think a lot of thought was spent, maybe about 30 minutes here, on this next move. And it kind of ignores the potential danger of the passed pawn for a moment. Queen f4 is played. Of course, it's very, very tempting to consider other moves, like f6 as an attacking try, knight h5 is an attacking try. do these work? I mean, only, I think, extensive analysis on this position will determine is White's attack actually winning here, potentially on the king side at a certain depth. With the limited engine power at the moment, depth 20, we're talking Houdini, it's not really finding anything concrete here after knight h5. Let's see, knight c7, what concrete attack is there? If we try and, you know, go for a hack attack, say rudimentary attack like this, it can just be taken, and black can always sidestep now with king h8 and rook g8. That's part of the story of black's, you know, defensive resources. And the other thing is the knight is really only 2 squares away. And we considered that this move queen f4 had a certain cleverness to it, that if the knight really wants to come here, by keeping the pawn there for a moment longer instead of committing to f6, then it's stopping that sort of defensive reaction, knight c7 to e6. But of course there's always this square. But we, to be honest, didn't consider e8 as a defensive method, because intuitively it's like imprisoning one's own rook on f8. But on the other hand, weight has to be given to this pawn in kind of tying down an entire rook. White's only with 1 rook now, not 2, so this rook is the one keeping an eye on the pawn if needed. As the queen's kind of gone away from the pawn, the pawn's potential threat to queen, the threat is stronger than the execution. The pawn is there as a real major concern in the background of all these attacking variations, the shadow of this b pawn. And in fact, the knight kind of did its job in getting that pawn there, and now makes a defensive retreat to c7, which gives it the opportunity of either e8 or e6 to be able to try and defend g7, which was looking extremely critical in many of the variations. And in fact, now we see a slight test of this. f6 is played, and I'm pretty sure we're reaching an only move scenario, it would seem. Well, there's very few moves available. If g takes f6 in the position, just to show, knight h5, it just looks exceptionally dangerous. But I mean, for example, fg, it just looks incredibly dangerous, but does black have actually defensive resources? I mean, these sort of variations were looked at. Magnus has rook g8 here. He doesn't mind about losing the exchange. He's got this huge passed pawn here, so he can afford things like this. If queen h6, rook g7, if he just wins, if white just wins the exchange, that's kind of the end of the attack. Black's actually going to be hugely better here, with the possibility of b2 and bishop f5 at some point, or even just knight b3 as a pawn chain attack as well. So what is black actually threatening? Well, things like bishop moving and then knight b5. So this kind of attack doesn't seem to work here. Even g takes f6 might actually be pliable. It's incredible to consider. But g6 looks like an idea, and knight e8 needs to be considered as a defensive resource. But g6 was played. And here, okay, we've got this potentially losing square to be mating the king. But we've also got this h-file. If white can arrange something like this, the problem with these scenarios of trying to double on the h-file against h7, okay, it prevents, if we've got a queen on h6, we're preventing h5 from that. But this pawn, the shadow of the pawn is always there. We're going to have to do something spectacular, like allow the pawn to queen to give this a little bit more time potentially. It's all about time. A lot of the attacking plans can be seen to be too slow if put under the scrutiny of the full resources that black has at his disposal. We see Vishy trying in this position, queen h4. It's kind of going all in, this attack. Now, if he kind of plays knight e2, that might signal the end of his attack, really. But it does keep some flexibility. You know, maybe later the knight, if the queen moves, we put pressure on d5. But black might just, you know, play knight e6. And if we're going like this, this is a kind of lovely blockade now. And black starts to be more than okay with moves like queen a5 or queen b6. Apparently, this is absolutely, well, the queen is just not coordinating with the rook to do something on h7. We've got a blockade on e6. Where's the attack? So it's difficult to imagine this can be anything but much better for black. So white has to really try something. He goes all in with queen h4. And it seems like a crude plan of attack. Queen h6, rook f4, rook h6. Has Vishy been seeing too many of my 3-minute videos? Let's find out. So the first surprise here, though, is that the rook is voluntarily imprisoned with knight e8. Let's imagine knight e6 was played for a moment. Engines don't really like knight e6. In fact, this is funny. Imprisoning the rook would seem like a paradoxical idea. You don't like to usually, as a general rule, imprison your own pieces. But it turns out that knight e6, the engine evaluation is like plus 13. It looks as though black had it after knight e6, but after knight e8, black should be okay. So why is there this big disparity between knight e6 and knight e8? Let's have a look. So queen h6, b2, trying to tie down the rook. White doesn't care about that. Rook f4. So if the knight takes, we just mate on g7. We queen here. Bishop f1. And how does black actually stop rook h4? And we saw some of these variations convinced. Is Magnus going to lose today? Is he going to get mated today? How does black actually stop this sort of thing? You know, if king h8, this doesn't help. We just play rook h4 here. How is h7 defended? There's no nuisance moves on the back row here. Queen e1. We just play rook h4. There's a token check. Either king h1 or king g2. King h1. The checks just run out here because bishop g2, queen d1, knight f1. Thanks very much. Even though black's a queen up, he's helpless here. It's actually a forced mate in 5. Queen h5 doesn't help. Take. Bishop h3. We're now threatening bishop f5 mating on h7 again. I know this is absolutely crazy stuff. But let's say bishop d7. There's not just the threat of bishop f5. Bishop f5 or bishop takes e6 is actually both. They're both mate in 3s. If bishop f5, you know, we're just getting this mate like this. So all the difference in the world is within, believe it or not, it seems on brief inspection here with engines, some of the strongest engines in the world, it seems Magnus's move here, knight e8, might be the only move in the position to avoid getting crushed on the h-file, to avoid being king's crushed, can I say, on the h-file. Knight e8, a spectacular defense. And how many pieces have been used by black, been moving this game? This bishop seems to have not moved in this game. I'm not sure if the queen's moved at all in this game. So these two have just been standing still. This one's been imprisoned, and all 4 are now just sitting on the back row, maybe just expecting a miracle from the passed pawn here. Is the passed pawn the guy in the Matrix that goes to the computer place? Is everything banked on the passed pawn? Where is white's attack though? The passed pawn is tying down a whole rook. So what's the key difference here in this position? Well, let's find out, because queen h6 now. So it looks as though rook f4 to h4. b2. We're going in for this h-file attack now. This was the last chance apparently to be equal technically from an engine point of view with knight e2, believe it or not. Knight e2. And what is white potentially doing? You know, maybe, you know, d5 is a target as well with knight f4. So let's imagine bishop f5, knight f4, bishop e4 defends here. And apparently this is going to be about equal. Incredible complexity of positions, but white goes all in with rook f4, and we have this queening, so black has an extra queen. And we were just looking at bishop f1. We didn't actually consider knight f1. We were looking at bishop f1, and unfortunately Vishy played knight f1, and we're going to have a look at bishop f1 extensively. So there's a move 28, knight f1 was played. Unfortunately, white's threat of rook h4 can be parried in this position. Can you spot, if I gave you 10 seconds, what would you play here with black to try and parry the threat of rook h4? Remember, you're a queen up. So what would you play here? And this is the final move of the game, but I want to quickly go after bishop f1 after this. Okay, unfortunately queen e1, and the queen can just sacrifice itself to stop this attack. So Vishy had to resign here. It's a shocker. It's a shocking finish. It was a very abrupt finish for what seemed to be at one point enormous complexity of a multitude of different, attacking plans. But let's have a look at bishop f1. This was the focus of most of our attention on bishop f1, trying to get this attack working on the h file. How does black actually defend here? Well, I think Magnus and Vishy both were looking at queen d1 for a long time, and there's spectacular variations that can result here. So rook h4, and black's only move is now to stop the mate, queen h5. Unbelievable stuff. Knight takes h5. We want the rook to work with the queen on h7. G takes. Now here there's an attacking possibility which I think both players had analysed. First of all, we rule out, well, there's two possibilities here which are fascinating. If rook takes h5, bishop f5. Now bishop h3, this is a Magnus line, bishop g6, e6. Magnus had calculated all this and calculated here he thought he'd be okay with knight takes f6. And he's right. The engines, at least, at a big depth here, 2021, they think black's okay with this counter knight sacrifice in this line. Black's okay here. Amazing stuff. But, yeah, black is actually a pawn up and doing okay here. More than okay. Black's slightly better. We're talking about less than half a pawn. So a fantastic try, though. But Vishy had been looking at bishop h3, and what he discovered in this line was that after bishop takes h3, rook takes h3. I know this looks a bit slower piece down, but white is threatening the lethal rook takes h5. But unfortunately, black in this position either has queen b6 or queen b8. And that will guarantee perpetual checks. Again, the back row has been exposed. White's king safety, he's just one move away from delivering a match equalising blow here with rook takes h5, but alas, it's too slow. Queen b1 check, there's a big vacuum here for perpetual checks to be ripe. There's just no way of escaping the checks. Either queen f5 or queen d3. And it's perpetual check if nothing else, or queen g6 just is actually it's actually better for black. It's more than 2 pawn advantage to black. The queens are going to come off, and that's not very nice. Knight c7, the knight's going to go to e6, and black's a bit better, if nothing else. But there's even just knight c7. And if white has to play queen takes, then it's even better. The rook's kind of stranded for a moment. If it has to get out with h5, we lose g5. So it's just nasty, and it all stems from this. It's just incredible that there's queen b6 or queen b8. The queen had been doing nothing up to this point, but this line, it's amazing the two variations which both these fine, super fine GMs had pointed out here. That so either the rook takes h5 line, Magnus's line. This is just incredible stuff. This e6, all this vision that this is safe enough for black because of knight takes f6, and Vishy's line that it doesn't work because of this queen b6 or queen b8. So it just didn't seem to work. What do engines think? Was there any way of getting this working? This bishop f1. Engines think after queen d1, rook h4, queen h5, takes, rook takes. the endgame move is just to take on h5, not mess around with bishop h3. So we have this bishop f5, and to equalise with white has to now play g6 apparently. After bishop takes g6, rook g5, and what's the threat here? Well, h4 is the threat, but it's a bit of a slow threat. But what does black actually do? Queen b6. I think he has to. Is it hunting down a perpetual, or is it going to just take on f6? If we go for h4, we just take on f6 apparently. And this position should be in the realms of perpetual check now, like this: queen f3. HG, even though white's a piece up, his king safety is compromised to the extent we're going to get another perpetual check scenario. So unbelievable that these variations, there's tons of these attacking plans are analysed in the live commentary video. It hasn't really been doing justice to this brief overview for the wealth of attacking resources and counter attacks that were available. But in the game we just saw a very tragic abrupt ending, a kind of weakness of the last move, that all these other lines have been analysed, but there's a kind of basic weakness of this, that it's actually weakened this diagonal slightly, making queen e1 quite a powerful defensive resource, as we saw here. There's really nothing white can do now. If he's without that rook, there's no attack here. He resigned here, so this puts Magnus 3 points up, formidable lead. There's a theoretical faint chance of Vishy winning 3 games in a row, but I don't remember the last time, to be honest. Magnus Carlsen has lost 3 times in a row in his career over the last 10 years. I think that would be unbelievable. I don't think it happens. I mean, in strong tournament play, that he lost 3 games in a row. Maybe someone can correct me on that. But let's see tomorrow what happens. If Vishy can win tomorrow, then the match is extended. If it's a draw tomorrow, then the match ends immediately, because it's just the best of 12 games. Fantastically interesting game today. I hope you enjoyed both the live commentary and this very brief overview and summary of this game. Comments or questions on YouTube, and see some of you tomorrow on the live tomorrow for what might be the last game. Thanks very much.